The Maid Who Polished the Same Door Twice, a Miss Marple mystery. Chapter 1. The Scream in the Passage. Nobody in Marpit Green ever forgot the scream, though in later weeks half the village would swear they had heard it from their own firelit rooms, through fog and shut windows. In point of fact, it was Rosie Gribble who screamed, and she was inside Marpit House itself, standing at the foot of the back stairs with a dustpan in her hand, staring at something that ought not to have been there. Something was a man. He lay on his side on the bottom step, one arm flung out across the worn flags, his face turned to the wainscot, as if he had fallen asleep and did not wish to be looked at. The small torch he had carried still lay somewhere above, at the head of the flight, switched off, neat as a thing put down with intention. His head, Rosie saw the dark bloom on the step beneath it, and that was when she screamed. Fog had come down on Marpit Green that evening, like a curtain drawn across the world. The Colonel's dinner party had ended in a haze of candlelight and stiff conversation, and the guests were standing in the front hall saying their goodbyes, slow goodbyes, with shawls and gloves and the polite fiction that nobody wished to hurry into such a night, when the scream cut through them. Miss Jane Marple, a plump elderly lady in a wool cardigan who had been a guest at that table, turned her head towards the back passage with the alertness of a robin hearing the first crack of a frost. She was, on the surface, exactly what she appeared to be, a harmless spinster who knitted and listened and murmured, "Dear, dear," at the right moments. Villagers who had known her less than a month had already pigeonholed her as sweet and vague. They were wrong, but it did no one any harm yet. Colonel Marlott was first through the green baize door, his face the colour of the fog outside. He came back slowly, walking as men walked who have seen something they do not wish to describe to women. "Ring for the police, Iris," he said to his wife, very quietly, "and for God's sake, keep everyone out of the passage." Mrs. Marlott, a woman of sense in a grey silk dress, did not flutter. She sent Palfrey the butler to the telephone and marshalled her guests as if they were prize poultry at a show, herding them firmly backwards into the drawing-room. The chemist, Cecil Minter, had gone white and kept saying, "The doctor, it's the doctor, isn't it?" in a voice nobody answered. His wife Doris held his arm with a face like a closed door. Mrs. Oriel Frayne, the chairwoman of the Garden Society, a handsome woman of 52 with silver hair perfectly swept, sank into a chair by the fire and said, in a voice of admirable composure, "Poor man, poor man." He was only saying an hour ago how the fog agreed with him. She pressed her handkerchief to her lips. It was the right thing to say, the right way to say it, and Miss Marple noticed that the handkerchief was quite dry. The locum doctor, Dr. Hilary Venn, had come to Marpit Green a fortnight before to hold the fort while old Dr. Trimble took the waters at Harrogate for his liver. He had been a quiet, pleasant-spoken man of 38 or so, with a high colour and a way of flashing a smile that made ladies of the village feel young again. He had lodged at the Marlott house at the Colonel's own invitation. No sense in a fellow rattling round a draughty inn when we've 3 spare rooms. And he had been, last thing, in everyone's company, saying he would just fetch his case and look in on the blacksmith's boy who had croup. That had been the last of him. Inspector Quill, of the county CID, was a youngish man, close-grained and careful, with the slightly aggrieved air of a terrier asked to hunt in thick fog. He arrived within the hour, driving himself in a police Wolseley with his sergeant, a pale young man called Peel, who took notes. Quill stood over the body at the foot of the stairs and pulled at his moustache. "Fell down the stairs, by the look of it," he said. "Steep old flight this. Dark as the inside of a boot. Bulbs gone, I see." He said it off-handedly, but his eyes had already found the torch at the top of the flight, and something in the way he looked at it made Miss Marple, who was watching from the passage doorway with a humility that was almost professional, pay very close attention. It was Miss Marple who noticed, before the police surgeon had even been telephoned for, that Dr. Venn's spectacles, he wore rimless reading glasses at table, were in their folded case in his breast pocket, and that his pocket watch was still ticking, and that both his hands were clean. It was also Miss Marple who noticed the candlestick. In a niche in the passage wall, between the study door and the stair-foot, stood a heavy brass chamber candlestick of the old sort, kept there for blackouts. The Colonel had mentioned it at dinner, a rambling story about a Zeppelin raid his father had talked of. The candlestick now stood in its niche at a slight angle, as though someone had set it back in a hurry. Anyone might have done that, of course. Servants brushed past it with trays, but Miss Marple stored the angle away in that orderly mind of hers, where it joined the torch and the folded spectacles and the dry handkerchief of Mrs. Oriel Frayne. There, my dear," she said to Rosie Gribble, who sat on the pantry stool shaking like a leaf in a draught. "You found him, didn't you? That must have been a terrible shock. You were polishing the passage woodwork, I suppose. Such a pretty shine on the study door. I saw it from the drawing-room end. You must have given it a very good rub." Rosie looked up. A maid of 19, with red wrists and frightened eyes and an honest, plain face, she had been crying. "I polished it twice, miss," she said, in a voice that wobbled. "Once this afternoon, and once again tonight, after." She stopped, and her face crumpled. "Oh, miss, it came up all dull, like somebody'd laid a wet flannel against it all night." Miss Marple patted her hand. "Dear, dear," she murmured. "A wet flannel, in that dry passage. How odd." But the door, she reflected, the door between the study and the place where Dr. Venn had died, had been polished twice, and someone in Malpit House had taken very great care, on a night of fog, to wipe clean one particular panel of it. She wondered who had been out in the fog. Chapter 2. The Company at Malpit House. To understand the evening at all, one must understand the company. Malpit Green in the autumn of 1957 was a village of perhaps 400 souls, grouped around a grey church, a grey inn called the Plough, and a green that was not green at all in October, but a sodden collage of fallen leaves and the last brave dahlias. Its houses straggled up the lane towards the hollow where the old marl pits lay, long disused, full of black water and dead elms. Rich men never came to Malpit Green. It was a place of doctors and solicitors' clerks and retired officers, of gentlewomen with small incomes and gardens that were their chief vanity. Malpit House stood at the head of the village, a square Georgian pile of warm brick, its terrace running along the back of the house, past the study's French windows and the yard door into the service passage. It belonged to Colonel Osmond Marlott, late of the Indian Army, a bluff man of 60 whose conversation consisted chiefly of dogs, drains, and the iniquities of the county council, and to his wife Iris, nay, that sharper Marlott, who had run the house on his pension with an efficiency that might have made a smaller man uncomfortable. Their niece, Miss Patricia Marlott, Patsy to everyone, lived with them, a dark-haired girl of 24, with a restlessness that showed in the way she drummed her fingers on table edges and looked at doors. The dinner party on the night of the fog was not a grand affair. There were 10 at the table, the Colonel and his wife, Patsy, Miss Marple, who had lately taken the little cottage by the churchyard, and was therefore new enough to have an interest, the vicar, the Reverend Septimus Dance, a thin, nervous man who laughed at his own jokes a moment too late, and his sister, Miss Ellen Dance, who kept house for him and said very little, Cecil Minter, the chemist, and his wife Doris, Miss Tamsin Crowle, the postmistress, a sharp-nosed spinster who was the Colonel's cousin and knew, in consequence, everything about everybody there was to know, and Mrs. Oriel Frayne, and Dr. Venn. Miss Marple, who had lived in villages all her life and had studied the species vicarage to cottage from her girlhood, had formed her first opinion of Dr. Venn before the soup was served. He was handsome, in a heavy way, and he knew it. He had a soldierly courtesy that sat oddly on a man of medicine, and the air of a man who has come up in the world and means everyone to know it. He wore a good watch, though he told the time by the clock on the mantel. He mentioned his motor car, a Riley he had bought, not 6 months ago, brand new, wouldn't take second hand for a sovereign, and he let it fall, more than once, that the profession had been very good to him. I don't grudge myself the little luxuries now, he said, with a smile that showed his teeth. I've earned them. Doctor, thought Miss Marple, or no doctor, there is something of the parvenu in that one. He reminds me of no one so much as young Mr. Ellsworthy, who kept the fishmonger's shop in my cousin's village and married the chemist's daughter for her money, and then ran through it, poor soul. At the other end of the table, Mrs. Oriel Frayne was being charming to the vicar. She was a woman whom the village considered a perfect lady, and she took pains to deserve it. Silver hair, cameo brooch, a voice low and musical, and a solicitude for the comfort of others that stopped just short of being touchingly selfless. She was the daughter of a clergyman, it was said, had lost a young husband in the war, had made a good second marriage to old Mr. Frayne of the bank, and had been left a widow with a competence and a reputation beyond reproach. Her garden at Honeysuckle Lodge was the envy of the county, and her chrysanthemums had taken first prize at the county show 3 years running. In Marlpit Green, to be Mrs. Frayne was to be above suspicion itself, and yet Miss Marple had seen the low-voiced exchange at the end of the meal, when the women were gathering themselves and the gentlemen were deciding whether to desert the port. Dr. Venn had bent his head to Mrs. Frayne's. They were, after all, seated side by side at table, and had said something that made her smile, a smile that did not reach her eyes, and she had answered him in a whisper, her lips barely moving. Miss Marple, engaged at that moment in a spirited conversation with Miss Ellen Dance about the price of butter, had seen nothing. But Patsy Marlott, seated across the table under the candles, had seen the doctor's mouth shape the words, "Then this evening, the back way, as we agreed," and she had seen Mrs. Frayne give the smallest of nods, once, like a woman accepting a necessity. Patsy thought nothing of it then. She was thinking of other things, of Bernard Clough, who was waiting for her, even now, at the yard door in the fog, and of what her uncle would say if he knew she had been walking out with a journalist from the county paper, a man who had once written that Colonel Marlott's speech at the ploughing match was the windiest oration since the siege of Lucknow. So when the men came in, and the coffee was brought, and Dr. Venn rose with his pleasant smile and said he must just fetch his case, the blacksmith's boy, you know, Croup is no respecter of dinner parties, Patsy slipped away a moment before him, out through the service passage to the yard door, into the fog that wrapped the world in grey wool. Bernard was there. He was always there, rain or shine, fog or starlight, and he took her hands and said, "Well, do I get an answer tonight?" "Not tonight," she whispered. "Uncle's in one of his moods, and there's something odd going on in this house, Bernard." "Dr. Venn, that bounder," said Bernard, who had met the doctor once and formed the reporter's instant conclusion, which was not flattering. The fog lapped at them. Patsy heard footsteps in the passage behind her, and the click of a torch being switched on, and she pressed Bernard back against the wall of the yard to let whoever it was pass. It was Dr. Venn, walking with the torch held low, going towards the back stairs. He did not see them. He passed within 4 feet of them and did not see them, which says something about the thickness of that particular fog and the direction of his own thoughts. "We've been seen," said Patsy, when the footsteps had died away. "We probably look like ghosts out here. I'd better go in." "No, wait, Bernard, you mustn't come." But he had taken her hand again, and then her face, and the yard door swung to behind them with a soft click, and neither of them heard the first sound from the passage within, a soft, heavy sound, like a sack of oats dropped from a height, and after it a gasp that died suddenly, as though cut off by a hand. The clock in the hall struck the quarter. At the drawing-room end of the passage, Miss Marple was admiring the shine on the study door with the innocent enthusiasm of an old lady noticing a servant's good work, and Mrs. Marlott was saying, with the faintest edge to her voice, "Oriel's been gone an age. She said she'd only fetch her shawl." The fog pressed against the windows like a face at the glass. Chapter 3. The Second Polish. The inquest was not held until the following Thursday, and during those days the fog did not lift. It hung over Marlpit Green like something with intentions, muffling the church bells until they sounded like bells heard under water, and making every sound in the lanes, a cart, a bicycle, a voice, seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. The village did what villages do. It closed ranks, opened curtains and talked. Rosie Gribble talked more than was good for her, to anyone who would listen, in the kitchen and at the back gate. She had polished the passage woodwork on the afternoon of the fatal evening, all the doors and the skirting and the old chest and the study door special, because the doctor had leaned his bicycle against it the day before and marked the paint. And she had noticed, she told the cook, a dull patch on that same door when she came to lay the fires the next morning. Not her work, she said, clinging to that. I polished the panels till they shone like a looking-glass, and in the morning there was a patch, dull as Sunday, like somebody had pressed a wet rag to the wood all night. So I polished it again, twice over, for it looked like a slur on me. The maid who polished the same door twice, said Mrs. Grummet the cook, wagging her finger. That'll be your name in the village from this day on, my girl. It was Miss Marple who drew the full story out of Rosie, over a cup of tea in the pantry, with the kindness that costs nothing and buys everything. Rosie, who had seen the body, needed little encouragement to relive the moment. She was one of those girls who find relief in repetition. But it was not the body Miss Marple wished to hear about. Tell me, dear, she said, when you polished the study door that afternoon, was the door shut or open? Rosie considered. Open, miss. A crack. The doctor was inside, writing at the desk. I saw his back. And the patch in the morning, where was it exactly? On the lower panel. Miss, this side, about so high. Rosie put a hand to her own hip, just where a person'd put their hand if they were steadying themselves, like in the dark. Miss Marple said nothing to that, but she sat with her tea for some minutes, looking out at the fog with the expression of a woman who has found a dropped stitch in a pattern and is deciding whether to work backwards or to start a new row. The police, meanwhile, had been thorough in their way. Inspector Quill interviewed the household and the guests, took statements, examined the staircase and the passage with Sergeant Peel's assistance, and had the body removed to the county town for the sitting of the coroner. Dr. Wicks, the police surgeon, a brisk man with a spotty neck, had given his preliminary opinion. Death from a fracture at the base of the skull, consistent with a heavy fall, the head striking the flags or the edge of the old oak chest at the stair foot. A bad step, a steep flight, a blown bulb, a gentleman unused to the stairs, said Dr. Wicks. These old houses. Misadventure, I shouldn't wonder. All the same, said Inspector Quill, when he had Miss Marple alone in the Colonel's study. For the inspector, though he would not have admitted it, had formed a respect for the old lady's observations, which she offered with such hesitations and apologies that they were difficult to disbelieve. All the same, there's one or two things I don't care for, and the torch is one of them. Miss Marlett says she saw the doctor go towards the back stairs with his torch alight. She saw the beam, she says, from the yard door. Very well. Now the torch is found at the top of the flight, switched off, standing against the skirting board, not so much as a scratch on it. If a man falls down a flight of stairs, the torch goes with him. It doesn't climb back up and switch itself off. Perhaps he switched it off, said Miss Marple mildly, and set it down and then fell. But why should he switch it off and set it down at the top of the stairs, in the dark, when the whole point of the torch was the dark? He was going down, you see, not up. His room's in the guest wing at the top of those stairs. He'd been to his room and was coming down again. That's what we're told, anyway, that he went up for his bag and never came down alive. Quill pulled at his moustache. The bag itself was found in his room, on the bed, packed, as though he'd set it down and gone on without it. A man fetching his bag to visit a patient doesn't set it on the bed and wander off. Unless, said Miss Marple, he never meant to fetch the bag at all. There was a silence in the study, broken by the hiss of the fire and the distant ringing of the church clock. A man who makes an appointment, said Miss Marple in her gentle voice, and keeps it quietly, in the dark. What would he carry, Inspector? Why, a torch. What would he not carry? A medical bag, which would only encumber him, and afterwards, if something happened to him, the person who arranged the body would have to dispose of the torch somehow. To leave it beside him at the foot of the stairs would have been most revealing, for a torch lying by a man who fell from the top would have been broken in the fall, so it was carried back to the top of the stairs and switched off and set down neatly. A little scene, you know, like the scenes in the village pageant, only rather more carefully done. The inspector stared at her. That's very good, Miss Marple. That's very good indeed. But you're suggesting the torch was carried up after the fall, after he was dead. I'm only an old woman, said Miss Marple placidly, and I know nothing of police work. But in my young days we had a housemaid who arranged a scene to look like a break-in after she had taken the silver teaspoons, and she was caught because she hung the picture crooked and then hung it straight again, and my mother said to her, "Annie, you have been too careful." It is the too careful thing that betrays us, Inspector. The switch, for instance. If the torch was alight when he fell, and Miss Marlotte saw the beam, then someone afterwards must have switched it off. Why? Because alight, it would have drawn attention. Whoever did that had a clear head and a cool one and time on those stairs. 2 days after that conversation, Cecil Minter, the chemist, was arrested. Chapter 4. The Coroner's Verdict. The arrest of Cecil Minter was, in the words of the landlord of the Plough, a 9 days' wonder that took 11. It was greeted with a universal gasp, followed almost at once by the universal qualification, "Well, but you know, he had quarrelled with the doctor, and so he had." The row had taken place in Minter's own shop the week before the dinner, in the hearing of 2 customers and the boy who delivered the papers. Dr. Venn had come in, pleasant as ever, and had asked, in a carrying voice, to be shown the dispensary. He was the locum, after all. He had a right to inspect. What he found there, or what he said he found, had caused his pleasant smile to stiffen and his voice to rise, and Minter to go red and then white. The words diluted tinctures were heard, the words I shall write to the county medical committee were heard, and the doctor's last words, quite plainly, before he stepped out into the lane, "You had better pray, Mr. Minter, that I am a merciful man." Half the village had heard the story by nightfall. The other half heard it from the vicar, who had been told it in confidence and had immediately needed to tell somebody, any somebody, to relieve his feelings. So when Inspector Quill took Cecil Minter into the county town for questioning and did not bring him back that night, the village nodded. Quarrel, motive. The doctor threatened to ruin him. The chemist's shop was closed, a shocking thing in itself, and Doris Minter's sister came over from Chollerton to sit with her, and the curtains of the house on the green stayed drawn the whole afternoon. Miss Marple called on Doris Minter that same day with a pot of her own blackberry jam, which was her way of arriving anywhere. Doris was red-eyed but talkative, in the way of people who have been warned not to talk. All he did was argue, Miss Marple. Men argue. Cecil wouldn't hurt a fly. He won't even drown wasps. He carries them out on a paper for their own good. You know he does. And as for this tale about the tinctures, that was Dr. Venn's spite. Nothing but spite. Because Cecil had caught him out in a little thing first. Doris lowered her voice. The doctor, he wrote his own prescriptions, posted them to himself, Cecil said, and Cecil told him he'd have to notify the committee himself, for a doctor couldn't prescribe for himself, not legally. That's what the quarrel was about, really. Pride, Miss Marple. Nothing but pride, and Cecil's tongue running away with him. He said the doctor had something on his conscience, and the doctor heard him, and that's when the threats began. It is a terrible thing, said Miss Marple, when a man holds another's livelihood in his hand. A kind of blackmail, you know, not the sort that takes money, but the sort that takes peace of mind. She left the jam and went away thinking. On the surface, Cecil Minter's motive was of the strongest. Ruin in a small town is a kind of death, and yet she could not see Minter doing it. She had watched him at the dinner party, the night of the fog, a plump, worried man with the hands of a craftsman who had spent the evening praising the beef and looking at his wife as though she were a burning candle. He had left the drawing room, it was true, at some point that evening. Both he and Doris swore he had gone to the cloakroom for his pipe tobacco, and Doris added, with the passionate particularity of a wife defending a husband, and he smoked it on the step of the yard door, because the colonel doesn't allow pipes in the drawing room, and the fog came in, and he was coughing when he came back. You could hear him. Inspector Quill had noted that too. A man who has just killed another man does not stand on a step in the fog, coughing, announcing himself. No, the chemist was a red herring of the first water, and Marple put him aside in her mind as a detective puts down a false clue, without anger, almost with affection. He would be released. The inspector would be embarrassed. The village would have its wonder, and then a new one. The inquest was held in the assembly rooms above the Institute on a Thursday of yellow gaslight and streaming umbrellas, for the fog had turned at last to a fine, mizzling rain. Dr. Wicks gave his evidence. Fracture of the base of the skull, consistent with a fall, the head striking the flags. The wound, he admitted under pressure from an alert coroner, was a single clean-edged impact, not altogether typical of a tumble downstairs, but these old stones are hard. The torch was produced and described. The blown bulb was mentioned. The blacksmith's boy was brought in, red and miserable, to say that Dr. Venn had visited him at 7:30 that evening and had promised to look in again, and had never come. The verdict was death by misadventure, with a rider from the coroner that the lighting at the head of the back stairs at Marlpit House left much to be desired. The village filed out into the rain, satisfied. Only Miss Marple lingered, waiting for Inspector Quill, who came down the stairs at last, with his hat in his hand, and a look on his face of a terrier who had been told the rabbit got away. "It will become an old woman to contradict the coroner," said Miss Marple, meekly. "But there is one thing, Inspector, that I have been turning over in my mind. The study door at Marlpit House. The maid polished it on the afternoon of the accident, and on the next morning there was a dull patch on the lower panel, just about hip height, as if someone had wiped it with a wet cloth. Now the passage is dry, Inspector. The yard door was shut and bolted. Whatever came from outside was brought in on somebody's person." Quill looked at her. "You think the patch was blood?" "My dear Inspector, I should never dream of thinking anything so definite. Only, in my young days, when one of the maids had been out in the rain and had left a smudge on a door she had no right to touch, she always wiped it off with her handkerchief, and the handkerchief was damp, and the polish came off with the smudge, and the door was never the same again. My mother said it was the surest way in the world to find out who had been where they ought not to have been. A damp handkerchief, Inspector, gives itself away." She looked up at him with her innocent blue eyes, and the inspector, who was not a fool, went back to the county town that very afternoon with a request, couched in official language, that a certain panel of a certain door at Marlpit House should be examined, with particular attention to the possibility of blood, however faint, however old, and however carefully wiped away. On the following Tuesday, the laboratory report came back. The panel contained human blood, Group O, the same group, the police surgeon confirmed, as that of the late Dr. Hilary Venn. Chapter 5. The Man Who Heard the Thud. Now the fog lifted, and the village began to shiver for a different reason. Inspector Quill did not arrest anyone, which in itself was an announcement. He sent Cecil Minter home with an apology so stiff it creaked, and Doris Minter wept into the blackberry jam, and the chemist's shop reopened, and the village said, well, they let him go, so it wasn't him after all. And then, with the peculiar logic of villages, but if it wasn't him, who was it? Miss Tamsin Crowell, the postmistress, had been saving something up, as postmistresses do. It came out over the counter to Miss Marple, who had come in for a pound of the stamp paper, as it were, and stayed for 20 minutes of confidence. 3 letters, said Tamsin, in a low voice, glancing about her as if the very envelopes might be listening at the door. Hand-delivered, Miss Marple. No stamp, no postmark, pushed through the door, by his own hand, you understand. I've been behind this counter 23 years, and I know the look of these things. Twice I saw Dr. Venn going up the lane towards Honeysuckle Lodge, bold as brass, at 9:15 in the evening, and the second time I said to myself, Tamsin, you are looking at a doctor making a night call, and I believed it, for he was a doctor after all, and Mrs. Frayne has that constitution of hers, always ailing with something. She paused, important with knowledge. But the letters, miss, the letters, the first week he was here, 1. The second week, 1. And this week, the morning of the dinner party, it was 1 more, always the same. I'd swear it. A stiffish paper, the colour of a stone, with the address written in ink, no hand at all on the back. No name. Now I ask you, miss, who writes letters by hand and delivers them by hand and never signs them? A doctor with a patient round the corner would slip a note under the door, not deliver a letter like a valentine. There is one species of correspondence, said Miss Marple, that is always delivered by hand and always unsigned. Is there, miss? Said Tamsin Crowle, who had a very good idea that there was. But she did not say it, and Marple did not say it, and for the moment the thing rested there, festering gently like a splinter under the skin. It was Patsy Marlott who, the same afternoon, came to Miss Marple's cottage in a state of agitation that could not be contained in a teacup, and told her the rest. "The row at the dinner table," said Patsy, twisting her gloves. "I mean, not a row, but the doctor said something to Mrs. Frayne, low, at the end of dinner, and she answered him, and I heard what he said to her, because I was looking right at them, and I've got good ears. He said, then this evening, the back way, as we agreed, and she nodded, only once, like a woman agreeing to something she hated. And you are sure," said Miss Marple gently, "that it was Mrs. Frayne he spoke to?" "I'm sure." She went white, Miss Marple, quite white under her powder, and then she smiled her lovely smile and said something to him I couldn't catch, and he smiled back, and the conversation moved on. But I've thought of nothing else since it happened. Because you see, Miss Marple, I saw him go towards the back stairs with his torch, and Patsy stopped. She went out through the drawing-room door only a minute or two after him. I didn't think anything of it. People go and come at dinners, but they'd made an appointment, and it was for the back way, and he's dead. And then, because the girl was young and frightened and loved a young man who had heard something, she said the thing she had been holding back for a week, the thing Bernard Clough had sworn her to secrecy on, and had then, being a journalist to his backbone, urged her to tell at once, "For God's sake, girl, a man is dead, and I heard his death, and we can't sit on it." "Bernard was at the yard door that night," said Patsy in a rush. He was waiting for me there, in the fog, and we heard the doctor pass along the passage, and then we heard— Listen, Miss Marple, this is what we heard, both of us, a soft, heavy thud, like something giving way, and then a cry, a small cry, cut short, as if it was stopped with a hand. Bernard said it was a sack of oats dropped. He'd heard sacks of oats dropped. And I said it was a scream, and he said no, a cry, and neither of us did anything, because it didn't sound like what it was. The fire ticked in the grate. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap, and was silent for so long that Patsy said, "Miss Marple," twice, and touched her arm at last. "A soft, heavy thud," said Miss Marple, at length, in her quiet way. "At what time, my dear? Think carefully. What time did the clock strike while you stood at the yard door?" "It had just struck the quarter," said Patsy. "I remember, because I was thinking I must go in, and Bernard was holding my hand, and the quarter struck, and I said, 'There, that's the time.' And—" "The quarter after 9, said Miss Marple. "Or the half." "It was the quarter after 9, said Patsy firmly. "The first quarter, because the doctor had only just gone by with his torch, and I said to Bernard, 'That's the doctor, off to his patient,' and the clock struck the quarter, and Bernard said, 'Kindly do not discuss other men while I am embracing you.'" Miss Marple nodded, quite seriously, as though embracements at yard doors were the most natural occurrences in the world, as indeed they are, and always have been. The doctor, then, had passed Patsy at the yard door a few moments before the quarter struck, say a minute or two either side of 25 past 9, and a soft, heavy thud and a cry cut short had followed within the minute just after the quarter struck. The inquest had given the time of death as between 9:15 and 9:30, based on the stomach contents and the temperature of the body. The two agreed. The torch, on this new reading, had been alight at 9:25 at the foot of the stairs. It had been found switched off at the head of the flight by Sergeant Peel at 10:35 that same night. Between those two times, someone had gone up those stairs. Miss Marple looked at the fire and saw, in the coals, the shape of a woman in a grey shawl moving in the dark. There was a long thread in her mind now, and all the little facts were strung on it like beads. The polished door and the dull patch, the damp handkerchief, the torch that could not switch itself off, the hand-delivered letters, the appointment made in a whisper, the appointment kept in the dark, the blow, the gasp, and the stairs climbed afterwards in silence by somebody who wanted something from the doctor's room and had taken it, and had come down again past the body of the man she had killed and had gone out into the fog by the yard door, the same door where two young people had stood, unseen, unsuspecting, and had heard it all and understood nothing. "Dear me," said Miss Marple to the fire. Then she was Inspector Quill's ancient enemy, which is to say his invaluable ally. She rang him that evening and told him, in the course of a long and rambling account of her health, her rheumatism, and the price of coal, 3 things: the hour of the thud, the letters to Honeysuckle Lodge, and the appointment made at table. And she added, in a postscript as casual as a dropped stitch, "And I wonder, Inspector, if you would be so good as to make a particular inquiry as to whether Dr. Venn's motor car, the new Riley he was so proud of, has been driven anywhere since Tuesday night. Because if it was driven to the county town, say, or to Bristol—" The inspector's pencil stopped moving. "Bristol, Miss Marple." "It's only," said Miss Marple, "that in my young days I had a cousin who was a housekeeper at a military hospital in Bristol, and she told me the most interesting stories about the orderlies. So many of them, she used to say, had the most plausible manners, and some of them, Inspector, were the most plausible men she had ever met." She put the receiver down softly and went to make herself a cup of tea, and stood at her window looking out over the wet village while the kettle sang, and thought about a dead man with a brand new car and a pocket full of unexplained money, and a silver-haired woman who had been, in some other life, somebody else entirely. Chapter 6. 3 Letters and a Postmistress. Inspector Quill went to Honeysuckle Lodge the next morning, and Mrs. Oriel Frayne received him in her parlour with the composure of a woman who has spent a lifetime being equal to occasions. The room was pretty in a formal way: silver photograph frames, a vase of her own dahlias, a fire laid with an exactness that suggested the hand of a perfectionist rather than a maid. Tea was offered, and declined, and offered again. "I shall not keep you long, madam," said Quill, settling his notebook on his knee. "It is a routine matter only. On the night of the accident, you left the dinner party early, I believe." "I left to fetch my shawl, Inspector. The passage was cold, and I am of an age when one feels a drought." She smiled. "I dare say I was away for 10 minutes at most. When I came back, there was a great deal of confusion, and poor Mr. Minter was as white as his collar." "And you went home after the affair? After the—" Quill consulted his notes. "After the body was discovered." "I did not stay, Inspector. I am not one of those women who wish to be in the thick of dreadful things. Mrs. Marlott was kind to me, but I felt I could be of no use, and my nerves were quite shaken. My maid Bessie will tell you I was home in half an hour." Quill noted it, thanked her, and went away with the curious feeling that he had been interviewed rather than the other way round. Mrs. Frayne had answered everything, volunteered nothing, and had somehow conveyed, in the space of 10 minutes, that she was a woman of feeling who had known nothing and suspected nobody, and hoped, for her part, that the matter might be allowed to rest. It was Sergeant Peel who found the photograph in the doctor's room at Malpit House 2 days later. The room was exactly as Venn had left it, the bed turned down by Rosie at 6 o'clock, the packed bag upon it, the brushes in a row. Peel, turning out the drawers in the methodical way of sergeants, had come upon a flat leather writing case, and in it, pressed between the leaves of a 1934 diary, a group photograph of some 24 nurses and orderlies on a hospital lawn, the legend "Bristol Infirmary, Staff, 1934, printed beneath, and tucked behind it, face down, a smaller photograph, much older and creased, of a young woman in a nurse's cap. Peel turned it over and went very still. The photograph had been torn across, not carelessly, but deliberately, as one tears a thing one never wishes to see again, so that the face was gone. Only the cap and the shoulders and a fall of dark hair remained. A date was pencilled on the back, in a hand that was not Venn's, St. 1936. "Stands to reason," said Peel, when he showed it to the inspector. "It's a keepsake of some girl he knew in Bristol. He kept it, and somebody wanted it destroyed, or he tore it himself in a passion. Quill looked at the torn face, then at the group photograph, and put both in an envelope. "Ring Miss Marple," he said. "She's a user of the telephone. Ask her if she would care to look at these, since she knew the household. Old ladies have memories for faces." Miss Marple came that afternoon, in a woolen coat and a felt hat, and was shown the photographs on the study table with a great deal of respectful ceremony, as though they were treasures rather than police exhibits. She looked at the group photograph for a long time, her head on one side, her lips moving silently, counting the faces. Then she looked at the torn one and the penciled initials, and was quiet for so long that Peel thought she had gone to sleep. "Dear me," she said at last. 1936. That would be the year of the trouble at the infirmary, the girl who was struck off. I remember my cousin's letters about it, though she was at the military hospital, not the infirmary. There was a great scandal, a patient who died, and a nurse blamed, and an orderly who left in a hurry. Everybody said. She stopped, gazing at the photograph. "The hair is the same. I should know. I have seen that woman wear silver." Quill leaned forward. "You know this woman, Miss Marple?" "Know her, Inspector? Why, I suppose all the village knows her. It is only that I know of her rather better than most." She tapped the photograph with one finger, not quite touching the torn edge. "You see, my cousin was a housekeeper at the military hospital at Bristol for 18 years, and she kept a scrapbook. When a scandal was spoken of, she cut out the newspaper account and pasted it in. She was of that generation, the sort who kept everything, and in that scrapbook there was a photograph of a nurse called Trask." "Trask?" said Quill, writing it down. "S.T.," said Miss Marple. "Susan Trask, struck off in 1936, though there were many who said she was innocent. That the blame belonged to a man, an orderly, who had gone off with the money from the dispensary safe and left her to bear it. She disappeared afterwards, poor creature. One heard she had gone abroad, or changed her name, or been drowned. People always say one of those three." She handed the photographs back to him and looked at him over her spectacles with her mild, china-blue eyes. "And now," she said, "a dead man has come to our village with a photograph of Nurse Trask in his writing case. A man who, by his own account, was earning his living as a doctor at the Bristol hospitals only a few years ago. My cousin used to say that the most plausible men she had ever met were the orderlies who had learnt to be everything to everybody. Some of them, she said, could have run the hospital or robbed it with equal ease and equal charm." She stood and drew her gloves on very slowly. "Inspector," said Miss Marple, "I wonder if it would be too much trouble to inquire whether Dr. Venn was ever registered with the General Medical Council, and whether his reference from Bristol can be produced. It is only a fantasy, of course, but I have noticed that when a man is too charming and too successful and keeps a photograph of a ruined nurse in his writing case, he is very often not quite what he appears." Chapter 7. The Man from Bristol. The telegraph wires did their work, and Inspector Quill went to Bristol himself, taking the morning train with a list of questions that grew longer the nearer he got. It was all there, in the dusty registers of the Bristol Royal Infirmary and the county police records. The orderly Leonard Goff, engaged in 1932, discharged in 1936 under a cloud. The morphine from the dispensary safe that had found its way, through hands that were never quite identified, to a private address in the docks. The patient, a Mrs. Galbraith, who had died of an administered dose when her chart called for a fraction of it. The nurse on ward duty that night, Susan Trask, who had been held responsible, struck off and lost, in that order. And the orderly, Goff, who had been questioned and released for want of evidence, and had left Bristol within the month, taking with him the old matron, interviewed in her retirement at Clifton, told Quill with a wrath that had not cooled in 20 years, taking with him nothing belonging to him, Inspector, except a young woman's reputation, which is a thing no man should be allowed to carry off and sell. For that, the matron said, was what he had done. He had sold it. There were letters, she said. After the girl went, the other nurses found letters in her locker, answering letters from a solicitor in London about a sum of money she had been promised in exchange for her silence. She never took it, God bless her. She tore them up and went away, and we never saw her again. But I have often thought, Inspector, that if truth were told, Leonard Goff did not steal the morphine at all, or not only the morphine. He stole her good name, and he tried to sell it back to her, and when she would not buy, he kept it. And if I know that man, he has been spending it ever since. Quill came home to Malpit Green with a file under his arm and a new light in his eye. Dr. Venn had never been registered with any medical council, in Bristol or anywhere else. His references were letters of recommendation, 3 of them, all in the same rather florid hand, and all from names that proved, on inquiry, to have died in the services during the war. Convenient dead men, who could not be asked whether they had ever employed a locum so plausible, so punctual, and so very well dressed. Dr. Venn had been in the Army Medical Corps, the record showed, as a sergeant, mark you, and had left the service in 1946 with, among other things, a set of papers not his own, the property of a Captain Venn who had died of wounds at Caen. It was a simple trick, and an old one, the papers of the dead officer in the pocket of the living thief, the gentle alteration of dates, the confidence that nobody would ever check. He was the most complete rogue in the west of England, said Quill, with professional admiration, and he came here to blackmail a woman, and somewhere in this village there is a woman who knows him by another name, and she has been living in terror of him for 20 years. Miss Marple, to whom he told the whole of it over a cup of tea in her small sitting room, nodded as though he were confirming a sum she had already worked out for herself. And the money, Inspector? You said the regiment was pleased with his dealings. I wonder, was there money? Quill produced, from his file, a copy of a bank book found in the doctor's writing case, beside the photographs. 2 deposits, £200 on the 12th of September, 250 on the 3rd of October, both paid in cash, at different branches, in different towns. No withdrawals, he said. He wasn't spending it, Miss Marple. He was banking it, and hoarding it, and probably boasting of it. Every penny of it will have come from the same source, a frightened woman paying to be left alone. That is the tragedy of blackmail, said Miss Marple, looking into the fire. The blackmailer is never satisfied, and the victim never believes the end will come. So she pays, and in the end she pays with something more than money. In my younger days there was a case in the village where I grew up, a lady's companion who had been a nurse and was being bled by a man who had known her in the hospital. She paid him for 7 years, Inspector, 7 years, and when he asked her for the 8th, she stopped. Well, she said afterwards she hardly knew what came over her. She was the meekest little creature in the world until the moment she was not. Quill looked at her sharply. You're thinking of the candlestick, Miss Marple. I am thinking, said Miss Marple placidly, of a woman of iron self-control who has arranged her life and her garden and her gloves to a hair's breadth, and who met, at a dinner party, the ghost of her ruined youth, smiling, prosperous, and with a price, and who said to him, in a whisper at the table, going very white, I am thinking how carefully that woman washed her hands, and dried them afterwards, and I am thinking, Inspector, that the only question worth asking now is not who had the strength, any desperate woman has that, but what the blackmailer took from her that might still be found, and where. She set down her cup, because whatever he kept of her, Inspector, her letters, her photograph, her signed confession, call it what you will, she will have gone back for it the night he died. She will have climbed those stairs in the dark, past the body of the man she had killed, and she will have taken it away with her, and burned it, and thanked God for the fog. Chapter 8. The Chrysanthemum on the Pillow. It was Bernard Clough who broke the story, and he did it in the Cholaton Mercury, with a headline that caused the village to be read aloud at every breakfast table in the county. Locum Doctor was not a doctor at all. The Mercury had got the whole of it, the Bristol records, the dead captain's papers, the sergeant's stripes, and if some of the details were a little highly coloured, the facts were the facts, and the facts were terrible. The village forgave the dead man for his death and began to remember his manner. He had always been too plausible. He had always smiled too readily. The chemist's quarrel was rehearsed again, and Mrs. Marlot's grey silk, and the way Venn had spoken of his new motor car. Leonard Goff, late porter, late orderly, late sergeant, late gentleman. Nobody now had a good word for him, and the general feeling, expressed in the plough by the landlord and agreed by all, was that whoever had hit him had done the county a service, and it was a pity he had not been drowned or gassed like a decent vermin, instead of dying on a lady's staircase. Miss Marple heard all this and said nothing. She went to tea at the vicarage, where she had got into the habit of taking her knitting on Thursday afternoons, and it was there that Miss Ellen Dance, the vicar's sister, said a curious thing. "You know, Miss Marple," Ellen said, bending over her needlework, "I have been thinking of that night, and I have been troubled in my conscience. The vicar says I ought not to speak of it, for fear of distressing people, but I cannot get it out of my head." "Do speak, dear," said Marple. "A trouble shared is a trouble halved, and I am very good at keeping my own counsel." "It was the fog, you see," said Ellen. "I had walked with my brother as far as the Marlpit gate, to see if he had dropped his scarf, which he always does, and I was coming back up the lane alone, and just at the lamp by the yard door, I saw the little Gribble girl, the maid at the house, you know, coming out through the yard. She had her shawl over her head, poor thing. I thought she must be going home for something or meeting her young man. It was nearly 9:30, and I remember thinking it was a strange hour for a maid to be about." She looked up, anxious. "I did not mention it, because the poor girl has had a dreadful shock, finding the body as she did, and I did not wish to add to her troubles. But will you tell me if it is foolish?" "Not at all," said Miss Marple. "Was her shawl grey, dear, with a fringe?" "I believe so," said Ellen, pleased. "Yes, I remember a fringe." Miss Marple finished her scone and thought about that. Rosie Gribble's shawl was brown. She had seen it hanging in the pantry, a plain brown wool thing, dog-eared with wear. There was no grey shawl with a fringe in the whole of the servants' hall at Marlpit House. But there was such a shawl, a handsome crepe one, the colour of smoke, hanging in the cloakroom at Honeysuckle Lodge, where Miss Marple had twice admired it, and where it always seemed to be draped, just so, in readiness for Mrs. Oriel Frayne. She said nothing of this to Ellen Dance, who was a good soul and would have been overcome with guilt, and she went home through the darkening lane with her mind busy as a hive. That evening there was evensong, and Miss Marple attended it, as she always did, for the pleasure of the old prayers and the comfort of the familiar walls. She was, she told the vicar afterwards, in good spirits. The fog had lifted, the air was sharp and clean. She let herself into her cottage at 8:30, lit her lamp, and went upstairs to change. The chrysanthemum lay on her pillow, where a person unused to such things would have laid it with care. It was a large bloom, the colour of old gold, of the variety the village called symphony, and it had been, until recently, perfect. Now its head hung broken, snapped across the stalk, the petals crushed in a grip that had not bothered to be gentle. Beside it lay a strip of paper, torn roughly from a notepad, on which was written, in letters formed with the left hand or with the right hand disguised, 4 words: "Mind your own needlework." Miss Marple looked at the flower, and at the note, and at her own quiet room. Nothing had been taken, nothing had been disturbed, as far as she could tell, but a drawer in her writing desk stood open an inch, and the catch had been forced with something thin, a knife or a nail file. She picked up the chrysanthemum and turned it over, and stood looking at it for a long time. "Symphony," she said aloud, to the empty room. "Only one garden in the village grows symphony, and it is not mine." She put the flower carefully in a vase, and the note in her pocket, and sat down in her chair by the fire. She was not, she found, afraid. It is the tribute of a lifetime's observation that a woman of Miss Marple's age is seldom afraid of a message she can read, and she could read this one very well indeed. It said, "I know who you suspect, and I know that you cannot prove it," and Miss Marple, folding her hands in her lap, replied to it silently, in the way of her generation, with the only thing that had ever answered such messages in the history of the world. "Dear me," she said, "we shall see about that. Chapter 9. The Candlestick in the Niche. The laboratory report on the brass candlestick reached Inspector Quill on the Friday morning, and he read it 3 times. And then he read it to Sergeant Peel, who took off his spectacles and wiped them, as he always did when the world required re-examination. The candlestick had been wiped, that much they had known. But whoever had wiped it had been in a hurry and had missed the deep curving lip of the base, where the metal folded under itself. There the chemist had found what his eye and his cloth had missed, a thin dried film, dark and brittle, of the sort that blood makes on old brass. Group O, the same group as the dead man's. Quill put the report down and went to the window. She struck him there, he said, in the passage, by the study door. He put his hand out to save himself and marked the wood. She wiped the door and wiped the candlestick, and set the candlestick back in its niche, and dragged him to the stairs, and laid him out, and went up in the dark to fetch what she came for. And the torch, he shook his head. The torch was the cleverest part. Leave it at the top, switched off, and it looks as though he fell coming down. Every schoolboy knows you fall down a flight of stairs, not up. Yes, sir, said Peel, who had not thought of it that way, and was annoyed to have it pointed out. And now, said Quill, I want Mr. Minter again. Bring him here, and this time, he tapped the report, this time, I want the truth of what he heard. Cecil Minter came to the police station in the county town with the white, set face of a man who has been dreading a moment for a fortnight. He had lost weight, his collar stood away from his neck, and he sat in the hard chair with his hands between his knees, looking at the floor. Quill let the silence grow, as old hands know how to let it grow, and then he said, very gently, You were at the yard door of Marlpit House on the night of the 15th, Mr. Minter. You left the drawing-room at about 9:20, saying you wanted tobacco for your pipe. You did not go to the cloakroom. You went out through the service passage to the yard, and you stood there in the fog, and you heard voices. I want you to tell me what those voices said. Minter's hands tightened. The silence stretched, and then it broke, as such silences always break, in a rush of words that had been dammed up too long. I heard him, he said. The doctor, I heard his voice, and I heard a woman's voice, and they were quarrelling, low, mind you, very low, but I was close, at the yard door, and the passage carries sound when the house is quiet. He was laughing, a dreadful laugh, quiet, like he knew something. And she said, You devil, you promised, you swore you would stop. And he said something I did not catch. And then he said, Nurse Trask always did have a temper, and said it again, laughing, Nurse Trask, like a joke between them. Peel's pencil had stopped moving. The room was very still. And then, said Quill, and then she said, I would rather die, and he laughed at her, and said, Oh no, my dear, you will pay, and you will live, which is much more useful to me. And that is all I heard, because at that moment a cart went by on the lane, and the fog swallowed the rest, and Minter swallowed. I knew I should have gone in. I knew I should have seen it. But I had told my wife I was only fetching tobacco, and I stood there like a fool, and when I came in, my pipe was empty and I was shaking, and Doris asked what was the matter, and I said the fog was bitter. And the next morning, when we heard, I knew what I had heard, and I was afraid of being hanged for it, so I said nothing. God forgive me, Inspector, I said nothing. Quill looked at him for a long moment. One more thing, Mr. Minter, the woman's voice. Could you have known her? In that fog, with her voice low as it was? No, Inspector. I am not even sure I could have sworn it was not the wind. He passed a hand over his face. Only it was not a girl's voice. It was a woman's. A woman of authority. The sort of voice you mind. When he had gone, Quill sat with his head in his hands, while Peel made a fair copy of the statement. And there came a knock at the door, and the station sergeant put his head in to say that Miss Marple was below if the inspector could spare her 5 minutes, and that she had brought him a pot of jam. Miss Marple sat in the waiting room with her jam in a string bag, looking as harmless as a turned-down lamp. Quill told her what Minter had heard. Minter's wife, he judged, had telephoned her the moment he left. There was very little in the county that was not known to Miss Marple within the hour. Nurse Trask, she repeated, softly. So he used her name, at last. He had a photograph of her, 20 years old, torn across the face. He had her letters, I don't doubt, the letters that proved his story, and she met him that night to buy them back, or to beg for them, and he laughed at her, and told her she would pay and live, and she stopped, and looked at Quill over her spectacles. She went up those stairs afterwards, said Marple, in the dark, with her heart going like a hammer, and she took from his room whatever it was he held over her, and she came down again, past his body, and out through the fog to her own house. And she has burned it all by now, Inspector. Every stick of it. You will not find Nurse Trask in this world again. She has been dead for 20 years. Then what do we charge her with? Said Quill, wearily. Why, with the candlestick, Inspector. Miss Marple sounded almost surprised. That is the beauty of it. She wiped the door, and she wiped the candlestick, and she thought she had been so clever, and a maid polished the same door twice, and gave the whole thing away. You have the blood, you have the blow. What remains is only the very old question of the heart, and that is a question for ladies, I think. Chapter 10. Tea at Honeysuckle Lodge. Whether it was chance or design that took Miss Marple to Honeysuckle Lodge on the following Tuesday, not even Miss Marple herself could have said with certainty, but she went, and she took a pot of her blackberry jam, which was her passport, and she was received by Mrs. Frayne in the pretty parlour with every mark of affectionate surprise. My dear Miss Marple, how delightful! I was just thinking I should like a little cheerful company. The magnificent chrysanthemums stood on the sideboard in a silver vase, their heads like blown gold. You will take tea? Thank you, dear, said Miss Marple, settling herself in the chair that was clearly kept for persons of consequence. But I hope you will not think it forward of me if I ask for a little of that tisane instead. My digestion is not what it was, and the doctor, she caught herself with a small distressed laugh. That is, I have been brewing my own herbs, with poor results. The tisane was brought, in a pot of its own, and the conversation slid into the channels that such conversations love. The price of butter, the new tiles on the church roof, the dreadful affair at Malpit House, and how one was to keep up the chrysanthemum's bloom in an autumn that had turned so sulky. Mrs. Frayne talked of her flowers with real pleasure. There was no art in it. And Miss Marple, sipping her tisane, talked of her cousin who had been housekeeper at the military hospital at Bristol, and of the nurses there, and of the strange careers that women made for themselves after the last war. They went into the world and made new lives, said Miss Marple, musing. New names sometimes. I have known several women who, for reasons of their own, began again in middle life. There is no shame in it, you know. A woman may have a past and a future, provided she does not let the past sit on her shoulder. Mrs. Frayne said, "How true," in the tone of a woman agreeing with a platitude, and poured herself more tea. The poor man, said Miss Marple, carefully, the poor doctor, as we must now call him, though Mr. Clough has made it plain he was no such thing. He seems to have been a person who traded in other people's pasts. I cannot help wondering who in this village had a past worth trading. The teapot moved in Mrs. Frayne's hand, and stopped and moved again. In that fraction of a second, Miss Marple saw the knuckles whiten, and the fine silver composure waver like a reflection in stirred water. I dare say we all have something, said Mrs. Frayne in her low musical voice, that we should not care to have raked over. You and I, Miss Marple, have lived long enough to know that the respectable are merely the unexposed. Dear me, how true, said Miss Marple, which was exactly what was expected of her. They talked for another quarter of an hour about the bazaar and the new curate and whether Mrs. Grummet's son was to be married, and then Miss Marple rose to go, and Mrs. Frayne rose with her, and they stood a moment in the hall while Mrs. Frayne drew on her gloves and walked with her guest to the door, for the afternoon had cleared and the air was fine. By the by, said Miss Marple, pausing on the step with her hand on the latch, Bessie tells me you were out on the green again last night, walking in the dusk. You do take your air, Mrs. Frayne. I do admire it. One must, at my age, said Mrs. Frayne smoothly. The doctor, the real kind, tells me nothing is so good for the liver as a turn before supper. She did not deny it. She did not wonder how Miss Marple knew, or that Bessie had told her no such thing, for Bessie had told her nothing of the kind. Bessie, indeed, had been at the pictures in Cholaton, and the green had been empty of walkers, and Miss Marple knew it, because she had walked it herself at dusk with her eyes open. Miss Marple went down the path through the wet garden between the rows of symphony chrysanthemums, standing to attention in their vases of air like a guard of old gold. And she thought about a woman who had told her, with perfect calm, a small lie about her movements on the night when a blackmailer had died, and about a grey shawl with a fringe, and about a torn photograph, and about a hand on a teapot that had steadied itself a quarter of a second too late. "The question," said Miss Marple to the chrysanthemums, "was always how, and now, I think, I know the how." She looked back at the house, where a curtain had fallen into place at an upper window, very quickly, and the why. She shook her head and went on down the lane. The why is the pity of it. The why is always the pity of it. Chapter 11. The Grey Shawl at the Pantry Window. Rosie Gribble came to Miss Marple's cottage at 8:30 that night, in the rain, without a hat, and stood on the step wringing her hands until the door was opened. She had walked the length of the village to do it, past the plough and the church and the wet black trees, having told herself 20 times that she would not come, and having come all the same. "I didn't know who else to tell, miss," she said, when she was settled in the kitchen with a cup of tea and the fire between her and the night. "I told Bert, and Bert said I ought to keep my mouth shut, for it was none of our business and people had been frightened enough. But it keeps coming back to me, and now with Miss Marple asking about the door and the polish and all, it all comes back." "Take your time, dear," said Miss Marple, who had the gift of making silence feel like sympathy. "Tell me exactly what you remember of that evening. Not the finding. I know about the finding. Before finding." Rosie sipped her tea. "I was in the pantry, miss, trimming the lamps. Mrs. Grummet had sent me down to see the wicks, for the one in the drawing-room was smoking something dreadful. It must have been gone 9:15 or near, and the pantry window, it looks out onto the area, you know, the little stone yard under the back stairs, and something moved past it, a shadow, miss, a person, walking quick and quiet, along the wall, from the yard end towards the back stairs. I saw a shawl, a grey shawl with a fringe, the sort a lady wears, not a working girl, and a skirt, and the shadow of it went up the back stairs and was gone. I thought it was one of the guests going up for her things, for ladies will fetch their own evening bags and won't ring for a maid, and I thought nothing of it. She set the cup down so suddenly it rattled. But it wasn't one of the guests, was it, miss? The gentlemen kept to the drawing-room, and the ladies with them, and the vicar's sister doesn't wear shawls with fringes, and Mrs. Marlot's shawl is plaid. I'd know it anywhere. And later, said Miss Marple gently, after the terrible business, you saw the shawl again. I saw it going back, miss. It must have been 10 minutes later, maybe less. I had finished the lamps and was coming up the area steps, and I saw the same shadow go past the window the other way, quick and quiet, and out through the yard door. It shut so soft I thought I'd dreamed it, and then I went through the passage to see whether the study door was closed for the night, and I found him." Her voice wobbled into a whisper, "and I screamed, and the rest you know, miss, because you were there." Miss Marple looked at the fire for a long moment. Outside, the rain had begun again, ticking against the pane with the patience of a village clock. "My dear," she said, "you told me yesterday that you polished the study door twice, once in the afternoon and once again, and that there was a dull patch the second time, as if something wet had lain against the wood all night. Did you tell anyone else about that patch? Anyone at all?" Rosie coloured. "I told Bessie," she said. "Bessie Chubb, her maid at Honeysuckle Lodge. She's my cousin, sort of, on my mother's side, and we walk out together when we get the chance. I told her about the patch, and about the grey shawl in the area. Oh, miss, I told her everything, the way you do, and she said I was to think no more about it, for it was the fog and my nerves, and grey shawls were common enough." Rosie looked up, and her face was suddenly older. "But Bessie, she'd know if her mistress has a grey shawl, wouldn't she, miss? A lady's shawl with a fringe. Bessie would know." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "I rather think Bessie knows." She sent Rosie home with an umbrella and a cake of her own making, and watched her go down the lane until the dark swallowed her. Then she stood at the window a long time, and the rain ticked on, and her mind moved in its orderly way through the facts like a woman turning the pages of a well-known book, finding the passages she had read before and the one passage she had missed. Rosie had seen the shawl go up the back stairs before 9:30 and come down again before 10. Patsy and Bernard had heard the thud and the cut-off cry just after the quarter. Minter had heard the quarrel and the words, "Nurse Trask." The maid had seen the figure, the maid had polished the door, and the maid had told Bessie, and Bessie served at Honeysuckle Lodge. And somewhere between the telling and the morning, Mrs. Oriel Frayne had learnt exactly how much of her night had been seen. Miss Marple went up to bed with the chrysanthemum on her mantelpiece. She had not been able to throw it away, and the note beside it, and she lay awake a long time, listening to the rain, thinking of the weight of 20 years, and of how a woman may carry a secret so long that it grows into her bones, and of what such a woman will do when the secret begins to walk abroad in the village in a maid's mouth. She made up her mind to speak to Bert, and to Bessie, and to the inspector, in that order, and like all the best resolutions, it came too late. Chapter 12. The Marl Pits. It was Patsy Marlott who found Rosie, though Bernard Clough found her first. They had walked out together that evening. Fog had come down again, softer than the last, and they had the lanes to themselves, and they had gone as far as the old marl pits, where the water lay black between the dead elms, because Bernard had a fancy for the desolation of it, and Patsy had a fancy for Bernard. It was Bernard who heard the sound, a thin sound, like a cat that had given up crying, and who went to the edge of the pit with his torch and saw the huddle of clothes in the reeds at the water's rim. "She's alive," he said, when he had waded into his knees and turned the girl over. "Patsy, run to the village. Get help. Tell them it's the Gribble girl. Tell them she's been hurt." Rosie Gribble lay in the reeds with a cut on her forehead and a bruise along her jaw, her skirts sodden, her hands scratched raw, as if she had been dragged backwards through brambles. Her eyes were open, but they did not see, and she would not speak that night, nor the next day, and when she did speak, at last, to the doctor, the new locum, a weary young man called Quarry, who had come to take up Ven's duties, she said only that she had been walking to the crossroads to meet Bert, that someone had come up behind her out of the fog, that there had been a hand over her mouth and a blow, and the smell of lavender, and that she remembered nothing after, not even the water. Inspector Quill stood on the bank of the marl pit, with his hands in his pockets, looking at the reeds, and the fog that lay on the water, and the broken fence where someone had climbed through. "This wasn't a fall, and it wasn't a fit," he said. "She was dragged to the water's edge and left to slide in. A girl who can't swim, in 20 yards of black water, on a foggy night. That's not an accident, Sergeant. That's a tidy ending to a story somebody wanted stopped." "Somebody," said Sergeant Peel, who was learning from his inspector, "who knew she talked." "Somebody who knew she talked," Quill agreed. "The Gribble girl told her cousin, the Chubb girl at Honeysuckle Lodge, about seeing a grey shawl in the area on the night of the murder. She told her young man. She told the cook," she said. He counted on his fingers. "The better part of the village, I shouldn't wonder, by way of the plough and the church porch. Only one of those listeners had a reason to be frightened by it." He turned away from the water. "Bring me the Chubb girl, gently, and don't let her mistress know she's being spoken to." But Bessie Chubb was not to be found at Honeysuckle Lodge. She had gone, her mistress said, with perfect calm, to her sister's at Chollerton for the afternoon. "The girl has been quite upset by all this dreadful business, Inspector. I told her to take a little holiday. One must think of the servants' nerves." And when the police cycled to Chollerton, there was no sister and no Bessie, and no sign that she had ever been expected. The village, informed by the landlord of the plough within the hour, drew the only conclusion open to it. The maid had been frightened off, or she had been sent off, and either way, there was a door in Honeysuckle Lodge that did not open when you knocked. Miss Marple, sitting with the vicar's sister in the twilight, heard the whole of it from Ellen Dance, who had it from the cook's boy, who had it from the station. "It is the pattern that troubles me," said Miss Marple to Ellen, who did not understand her in the least. "First a note on my pillow, warning me to mind my own needlework. Then an attack on the girl who saw a grey shawl. First the person who knows, warned, then the person who might tell, silenced. It is the behaviour of a creature caught in a trap, my dear, a creature that strikes out blindly at everything within reach, and a creature that strikes out blindly is very close to being caught. She went home by herself, through the fog, and on her doorstep she found, propped against the door, a single chrysanthemum, the colour of old gold, its head broken from its stalk and its petals crushed, as though a hand had closed on it in anger. There was no note this time. Miss Marple looked at the flower for a long moment, and then she stooped, carefully, for her knees were not what they had been, and picked it up, carried it into the house, and laid it beside the first one on the mantelpiece. 2 crushed flowers, 2 messages, and the second one from a woman who had been frightened out of cleverness into rage. "Dear me," said Miss Marple, addressing the 2 chrysanthemums, with the door of her cottage shut behind her and the fire not yet lit. "You have been very unwise, Mrs. Frayne. You have put the second flower where the first one taught me exactly where to look." She did not feel afraid. The curious thing about Miss Marple was that she never felt afraid at the moment when fear was most useful. She saved her trembling for the aftermath, when there was no longer anything to be done. She lit the fire and sat down in her chair and began, very quietly, to plan a tea party. Chapter 13. The Chrysanthemum Show. The Marlpit Green Chrysanthemum Show was an institution older than the motor car, and it took place, as it had taken place since the year of the Boer War, in the Institute Hall on the last Saturday of October. There were classes for the great incurved blooms, for the sprays, for the exhibition vases, for the novices section, reserved for those who had never taken a first, and for the any other variety class, which was the dustbin of the show and the most hotly contested. Tea was served by the ladies of the church, and the vicar gave a short address in which he compared the chrysanthemum, not without a certain reckless charm, to the human soul, which also required a sharp frost to bring out its best. Mrs. Oriel Frayne was, of course, the president of the society, and she moved among the benches with her silver head high and her smile in working order, awarding the prizes with such grace that nobody could have guessed, except, perhaps, a few, that she had been interviewed by the police that very morning, and had answered with the same composure she brought to the distribution of the silver cup. Miss Marple was there, in her best coat, with a woolly hat that she wore against her will, and she had brought with her, along with her entrance ticket, a scheme. She did not begin it until the judging was done, and the crowd had settled to its tea. Then she found herself, by the little accident that is so often designed, seated at the trestle table beside Mrs. Frayne, between the cucumber sandwiches and the vicar's sister. "I have been reading the most interesting history," said Miss Marple, in her gentle, carrying voice, addressing the table at large, "in an old magazine of my cousin's. It was all about the nursing profession in the last war, and the strange careers the women made afterwards. There was one case, a nurse at Bristol, struck off in 1936, poor creature, over a dreadful affair at the infirmary. Everyone said she was innocent, but she carried the blame, and she disappeared. And do you know, she was heard of afterwards in the south of England, married, and rose to a position of the greatest respectability. She changed her name, of course. One always does in those stories, and nobody, I believe, would ever have found her out, unless somebody from the old life had come looking for her." She had not looked at Mrs. Frayne, but she was aware, with the whole of that sharp attention which had been the making of her reputation in 3 villages, that the silver-headed woman beside her had gone still in the particular way of a woman who has heard her own name spoken in a language she thought dead. "The poor creature," said Mrs. Frayne after a moment without turning her head, "and somebody from old life. What became of him?" "That is the interesting part," said Miss Marple, helping herself to a sandwich. "He found her, and he was not kind. The old magazines used to call such men the leeches of respectable society. One reads of nothing else in those yellow pages. A man who lives by the fear of a woman, who grows fat on her silence, who cannot be satisfied. I believe, I am only an old woman, and I may be wrong, I believe she paid him for years, and then he came to her village and smiled at her across a dinner table and called her by the name she had buried, and that night she paused and selected a second sandwich with great care. That night, I believe, something broke in her. We all have our breaking point, you know, even the most composed of us. It is only a question of how long and of what it costs. There was a silence along the trestle table, of the kind that follows a dropped teacup. Ellen Dance looked bewildered. The vicar, who had a nose for atmosphere, began talking loudly about the weather, and Mrs. Frayne, turning to Miss Marple with her lovely frozen smile, said, "You have a morbid imagination, Miss Marple. I have always said so." "I dare say I have," said Miss Marple cheerfully. "It comes from a lifetime of watching people. One sees such odd things, if one watches long enough. Just now, for instance, I was watching your hands, and I noticed that you had cut your finger, there, on the forefinger, and that you had bound it with a strip of your handkerchief very neatly. I wonder, did you do that in the garden? The thorns of a rose bush are dreadful, are they not?" Mrs. Frayne looked at her bound finger, and then at Miss Marple, and for one unguarded moment, no more than the space of a breath, her composure slipped, and Miss Marple saw, beneath the silver and the smile, the face of a woman who had spent the night of the 15th of October climbing a dark flight of stairs past the body of a man she had killed, and who had cut her hand afterwards on the thorn of a chrysanthemum stem when she was planting it out of her own sight, in the dark, at the back of the border, where the police would never think to dig. "I cut it on the secateurs," said Mrs. Frayne, demonstrating to the niece of the house how they should be held. "Ah," said Miss Marple, "of course, the secateurs," and she smiled and folded her gloves in her lap and thought of a brass candlestick with a dark film in the fold of its lip, and of a door polished twice, and of a grey shawl washed in a sink at midnight, and of 2 crushed chrysanthemums on her mantelpiece, and of the small, damning particularity with which a guilty woman, asked about a cut, chooses to mention the very tool that cannot possibly have made it. The show broke up in the usual confusion of prize cards and borrowed vases. Mrs. Frayne took her silver cup home to Honeysuckle Lodge with her head high, and Miss Marple walked home up the lane through the early dark, and in the porch of her cottage she found Inspector Quill, waiting for her with his hat in his hand and a look on his face that she had seen on the faces of men who have been proved wrong and are not altogether displeased to be so. "They found the Chubb girl," he said, "at her aunt's in Cholaton. She'd gone to earth there, frightened out of her wits, and she's given us a statement, Miss Marple, that changes everything." Chapter 14. What Bessie kept Bessie Chubb's statement when Inspector Quill read it out in the police station in the county town, with Miss Marple present as a character witness for the maid, for Bessie had refused to say a word until the old lady from the cottage was in the room, had the effect on the room of a stone dropped into still water. Bessie, it appeared, had been frightened for days. She had seen her mistress come home on the night of the 15th, the night of the murder, not late, not flustered, but wrong. "I've lived with Mrs. Frayne 7 years, she said, "and I know her ways, and her ways that night were not her ways. She came in by the yard door at some time after 10, through the fog, and she went straight to the kitchen, not the parlour, mind you, the kitchen, and she lit the stove, which was out, and she stood there a long time feeding it." "Feeding it?" said Quill. "With what?" "Papers, sir. I watched from the back stairs. I'd come down to draw a glass of water, and I saw her, and I was so struck I couldn't move. She had a bundle of letters in her hand, and a photograph, and she put them in the stove one at a time, watching them burn, like they were something that had to be burned slowly to be truly dead. And then she took off her shawl, her grey shawl, the one with the fringe, and she went to the sink, and she washed it, herself, at midnight, with soap, in cold water, though the laundry was my place and she knew it, and she wrung it out, and hung it in the dark passage to dry, and I heard her say, standing there in the dark, I heard her say, 'That's done, that's done, that's done,' 3 times, sir, like a prayer." Miss Marple listened without moving, her hands clasped on her bag. "And the photograph, sir? I shouldn't have, but I kept the one thing she missed. When she was done with the stove and gone up, I fished it out with the tongs, not knowing why. only that it seemed a dreadful thing to burn a person's face. It was a corner of a photograph, charred round the edges, and it showed a young woman in a nurse's cap, with dark hair, smiling. A face I'd never seen, sir, not in this house. And I put it in my pocket, and I've carried it ever since, because I didn't know what to do with it, but I knew it mattered. She produced it then, wrapped in a handkerchief, a charred triangle of photograph, the face of a young nurse, dark-haired, smiling, 20 years younger, but the shape of the jaw, the set of the eyes, unmistakable. Quill looked at it, and at the June 1936 group photograph from Dr. Venn's writing case, and the likeness was there for any eye to see, the same face, the same smile, older now, but the same. Nurse Susan Trask, 1936. Mrs. Oriel Frayne, 1957. "There's one more thing," said Bessie in a small voice, "that I ought to have told you before, only I thought I was being foolish. In the morning after the doctor died, my mistress gave me a sovereign and a half-day holiday, and told me to go to the pictures at Cholaton, which was kind itself, though she'd never done such a thing in all our years. And when I came back, the border at the end of the garden had been dug, turned over, fresh, like somebody had been planting something out of season, and the chrysanthemums from the far bed had been moved there, stuck in above it, as if to hide the digging. I didn't think of it again, but after what they did to Rosie, I thought of it, and I thought, if I was the police, I'd dig that border." Quill stood up. By evening, under the lamps, with a warrant and 2 constables and a spade, he did. The police found, in the turned border at the end of the garden at Honeysuckle Lodge, beneath the transplanted chrysanthemums, beneath the golden heads of symphony, standing to attention in the dark, a leather writing case, oilcloth wrapped, and in it a bundle of letters in a woman's hand, all addressed to Mr. Leonard Goff, Poste Restante, Bristol, between the years 1936 and 1938, and a photograph of a young man in an orderly's uniform with a plausible smile, and a bank book in the name of Goff with a scratch of a pen, and, folded at the bottom, in the hand of Susan Trask herself, written at the darkest hour of her ruined year, a short statement, signed and witnessed, that the writer had known of the taking of the morphine from the dispensary safe at the Bristol Infirmary, and had said nothing. Leonard Goff had carried that paper for 20 years. It was what he had sold her, and would not return, and had come back to sell her again. Miss Marple stood in the cold garden while the lamps did their work, and looked at the chrysanthemums, and was silent for a long time. Then she said, very quietly, to Inspector Quill, "You will take her tonight, Inspector, but I would like, if you would permit it to an old woman who has had tea in that house, and eaten her cakes, and admired her flowers, I would like to speak to her first, alone. There is a way of doing these things, you know, that does not bruise, and she is a woman who has lived 20 years on her dignity. It would be a pity to take it from her, in front of the whole world." Quill considered her over the lamp, and saw that she was entirely serious, and entirely calm, and that behind the calm there was something he had never seen in Miss Marple before, not pity exactly, or pity, but of the practical kind, the kind that wants the dolorous business done with as little added pain as possible. "Very well, Miss Marple," he said, "I'll give you 10 minutes. The sergeant and I will wait in the lane." Miss Marple thanked him, and drew her coat around her, and walked up the path to the front door of Honeysuckle Lodge, through the wet garden, between the rows of golden chrysanthemums, to do the thing that had to be done. The light was on in the parlour. The curtains, for once, had not been drawn. Chapter 15. The uncurtained window. The parlour at Honeysuckle Lodge had never looked prettier, which Miss Marple observed with the part of her mind that always noticed such things. The fire was banked high, the silver gleamed, the chrysanthemums, the best of them, the ones not yet sacrificed to the border, stood in the cut-glass vase on the sideboard, golden and defiant. Mrs. Frayne had not changed for the night. She sat in her usual chair with her hands folded, and she looked at Miss Marple as she came in, with an expression of perfect, weary courtesy. "I thought it might be you," she said. "The police have been at the end of my garden for an hour, digging up my poor flowers. I watched from the landing window. Tell me, Miss Marple, shall I ring for tea, or have we passed the stage of tea?" "I think we have passed the stage of tea," said Miss Marple, sitting down opposite her, quite without invitation, in the chair that was kept for persons of consequence. "But I should like you to know, Mrs. Frayne, that I have not come as an enemy. I have come because there is a way of doing this that bruises and a way that does not, and I have some experience of both. You have been very good to me since I came to this village. The cakes and the kindness and the company. I will not forget those things." Mrs. Frayne looked at her for a long moment, and something in her face shifted, like ice beginning to move on a pond. "Then you know," she said. "You know everything." "I believe I know most of it," said Miss Marple gently. "I know who you were, and what he did to you, and what you did to him. I know about Nurse Trask, and the letters you wrote to Poste Restante, Bristol, and the paper he kept in his writing case, the one that would have ruined you. I know about the door, and the candlestick, and the shawl, and I know," she paused, "I know that whatever happened on that staircase was not the act of the woman who planted chrysanthemums in the dark and washed her shawl at midnight with her own hands. It was the act of a woman at the very end of what a human being can bear." There was a long silence, in which the fire settled and a coal fell. "He came to the dinner party," said Mrs. Frayne at last, in a voice so low that the words seemed to come from a long way off, "and he sat beside me, and he smiled at me with that smile I had not seen for 20 years, and he said, under the noise of the table, 'Why, Susan, how well you've done for yourself, how very, very well.' And I sat there with the salt cellar in my hand, and I thought, I am 62 years old, I have been respectable for 20 years, and this man can still turn me back into a girl of 25, trembling in a matron's office, being told my name would never be spoken again in any hospital in England." The words came then, in a rush, as they will when the dam is properly cracked. She had paid him, she said. She had paid him for years, small sums at first, sent with a covering letter to a forwarding address, then larger when she married old Mr. Frayne and had money of her own. She had paid him 200 guineas to keep the paper, and he had kept the paper and returned her money's worth in silence, and she had begun, foolishly, to hope. Then, a month ago, a letter had come, a letter in the old hateful hand, saying he was coming to take up a post in the neighbourhood, and that he would be obliged if she would call upon him at Marlpit House, and that he had reason to believe her husband's people had left her very comfortable indeed, and that he looked forward to renewing their old acquaintance. "He came to the dinner party with his price in his pocket," she said, "and he told me, there at the table, that the figure had gone up. £500, Susan, or I give your paper to the county paper, and we'll see how the Garden Society likes its president." And he said it smiling, Miss Marple, smiling, as if I were a servant he was dismissing. "And you were to meet him," said Miss Marple, "at the back way, as he said at the table." I agreed because I had to agree. I told myself I would go and reason with him, or beg with him. It came to the same thing. I took what money I could lay hands on without questions. I went up the lane in the fog with my shawl over my head, praying that I should find him alone. And I did find him alone, and I gave him the money, and he laughed. Oh, that laugh. And he said, "This is the last of it then. I'm going abroad in the spring, and I mean to travel like a gentleman, and it's fitting you should pay for it. 500 now, Susan, and I'll send you a bill for the rest from the south of France." And I said, "I have no more." And he said, "Then you'll find it, or I'll print what I have. Think of your position. Think of the vicar. Think of your dear husband's name." She stopped and looked into the fire. "I don't remember picking up the candlestick," she said. "I remember the weight of it in my hand, and I remember his face changing. That is the last thing I remember clearly. The face changing, the smile going, and then there was a great noise in my head, and he was on the floor, and the torch he had been holding had rolled a little way, and was lying there, switched on, throwing its light on the wainscot, and I stood looking at my hands and thinking, very calmly, well, that is done. Now I must be careful." And I was careful, Miss Marple. I wiped the door where he had put his hand. He had fallen against it. There was a mark. I wiped it with my handkerchief, and the polish came away with it, and I thought of the Gribble girl's morning face, and I wiped it again, and again, until it was as well as I could manage. I set the candlestick back in its niche. I remember it was crooked, and I straightened it. I carried him to the stairs. He was not heavy. He was never heavy. A man of that showy sort is all bone and vanity. And I laid him at the foot, with his head to the stone, the way a fall would leave him. And I went up the back stairs in the dark. I had his torch, you see. I had picked it up. I had carried it up with me. And I went into his room, and I found my letters, and the photograph, and the paper, and I came down again, past him, not looking, and out through the yard door into the fog, and home, and I burned them, every one, in the stove, and I washed my shawl, in cold water, with my own hands. She looked at Miss Marple with her calm, dreadful eyes. And I thought I had been so clever, she said, and all it took to undo me was a girl who polished the same door twice. Chapter 16. The Glass of Water. Miss Marple sat with the confession settling in the quiet of the room, and found that she was not, after all, as old and as hardened as she had supposed. She had heard confessions before, in village drawing-rooms, in vicarage studies, once, memorably, in a greenhouse among the tomato plants, and she knew the shape of them, the way they came out all at once and left a silence in which the confessor listened to her own words with surprise. She let the silence be. "Mrs. Frayne," she said at last, "I am not going to tell you that you will be let off, because I have never told a lie to a dying woman or a despairing one, and I do not mean to begin tonight. The inspector is in the lane, and he will take you to the county town, and the law will do with you what the law does. But I want to ask you one question, and I want you to answer it truly, because the answer does not matter to me, and it may matter very much to you." Mrs. Frayne looked at her, weary, exhausted, a woman who had been questioned by professionals all day, and found she had no more answers in her. "The maid," said Miss Marple, "Rosie Gribble, the girl who was dragged to the marl pit and left for dead. Did you do that, Mrs. Frayne?" The silence lengthened. A log turned in the grate, and the chrysanthemums on the sideboard seemed to hold their golden breath. "No," said Mrs. Frayne, and then, with a weariness that had in it a kind of wonder, "No, I swear to you, on whatever I have left to swear by, I did not touch that girl. I knew she had talked. I knew Bessie had told me. Bessie told me the very morning, poor soul, thinking she was bringing me gossip, and I stood there in the kitchen and heard how the Gribble girl had seen a grey shawl in the area, and I felt the world go round, and I thought, then it is all to be gone over again, all of it, the questions, the eyes, the knowing. But I did not harm her, Miss Marple. I have wished harm on no one since that night. I have wished harm on no one," her voice dropped, "except myself." Miss Marple sat very still. The pattern in her mind, which had been so neatly arranged, suddenly had a loose thread in it, and all her life she had distrusted loose threads. "Then who," she said, "put the chrysanthemum on my pillow and the crushed flower at my door? Who warned me to mind my own needlework?" Mrs. Frayne shook her head. "You must think I am a very thorough monster," she said. "I knew nothing of any flower on your pillow. I sent you no note. I have been too frightened, Miss Marple, to do anything but sit in this house and wait for you to come, and here you are, and here is what is left of me." There came into the silence the small, domestic sound of a glass being set down on a table somewhere in the house. Both women started. The fire had masked the creak of the kitchen door. The house was old and full of small noises, and yet Miss Marple, whose ears were elderly and excellent, had the sudden, certain conviction that the sound had come from the passage outside the parlour door, and that the passage, a moment ago, had been empty. The parlour door was ajar, as it had been these 20 minutes. Mrs. Frayne's maid, Bessie, was in the county town giving her statement. There was no one in the house but themselves, and yet the glass had been set down, very gently, very quietly, as a person sets down a glass when she does not wish to be heard. Miss Marple rose, with the stiff care of her knees, and crossed the room, and put her hand on the door. "Who is there?" she said, in her gentle voice, to the dark passage. A shape moved, almost gratefully, into the light of the hall lantern, a girl in an apron, with a tray in her hands, and on the tray a single glass of water. A girl with red wrists and frightened eyes, who should have been lying in the Marl Pit Cottage Hospital with her head bandaged, and who was instead standing in the passage of Honeysuckle Lodge, looking at Miss Marple with an expression that was not fear at all. "Rosie," said Miss Marple, quietly. "Don't be angry with Bessie, miss," the girl said. Her voice was the voice of the pantry, the voice of the back gate, but it had in it something Miss Marple had never heard there before. "Bessie's my cousin, and she did what I told her. I made them all do what I told them, Bert and Bessie and the doctor at the cottage, who said he wouldn't and then did, because there's ways of asking that aren't asking, and I've been here in this house since Tuesday, miss, watching her, watching you, waiting for you to come, because I knew you'd come. I knew you'd come the way you always come." She set the glass down on the chest in the passage, the glass she had set down a moment ago, too loudly, in the stillness, to make herself known. "Rosie," said Miss Marple again, and now her voice was careful, as it was when she addressed a child who had done something dangerous and did not know it. "My dear, what have you done?" "I've told the inspector," said Rosie Gribble, "that I was dragged to the pit by a woman in a grey shawl. I told him I smelled lavender. I told him I heard a voice. There's no such voice, miss. There was no lavender. My cousin cut my head with the edge of a spade, and Bert carried me down to the reeds and laid me gentle, and I lay there with my eyes open till Mr. Clough and Miss Patsy came along the lane. Bernard, I mean. He's a good sort. He plays fair, and they found me, all scratched and sodden, poor thing. And everybody said what a wicked creature had done it, and they all looked at the lady with the grey shawl. She stepped into the lamplight. Her jaw was set, and her eyes were dry, and in the apron and the passage she looked, suddenly, not 19 at all. "I meant her to hang, miss," she said. "I meant her to hang for the doctor, because he was my brother, you see, my brother Leonard, the only family I had, and she killed him, and she would have got away with it, with her silver hair and her chrysanthemums and her garden cup. And there's no justice in this world for a man like my brother except what his sister takes." Chapter 17. The Girl at the Back Gate. Mrs. Oriel Frayne had risen from her chair and stood at the parlour door with her hand against the jamb, staring at the maid who had, until this week, been nothing to her but a pair of arms that polished the brasses. Miss Marple stood between them, very still, and the two women, the one at the door and the one in the passage, regarded each other across 20 years of distance and one night of violence, and for a long moment nobody spoke. "I found the letters," said Rosie into the silence, "when I was turning out the pantry shelves, the week before Leonard came. Mam's old box with the lid gone. She'd kept everything, his letters from abroad, his photograph, the bills he sent her for the money he said he'd borrowed. He was a bad son, miss. He sent her letters only when he wanted something, and she sent him money she couldn't spare, and she died of the shame of him, I've always thought, though the doctor at the time said it was her heart. And when my brother wrote to me, at last, to say he'd found her, the woman who'd ruined him at Bristol, who'd got him discharged and his name blacked, who'd been the cause of it all, and she was living in a fine house with a fine name, a lady of the village, rolling in the old man's money. He asked me to help him, miss." Her voice stumbled. "He said we'd go halves, him and me. He said she owed us, and the family owed us, and it was no more than our due. And I said I wouldn't, and I said it again, and in the end I said I would, because he was my brother, and blood is blood, and I was angry at the world for Mam's sake. God forgive me." She looked at her feet, and then up, and the anger came back into her face like a tide. "But he was not to bleed her, miss. He told me he was not to bleed her. He was to frighten her, and take what she offered, and leave her be, and we'd have the money to start a little shop, him and me. And I believed him. God help me, I believed him. And then I saw him, the night of the dinner, at the back stairs. I had gone down to the pantry to trim the lamps, and I saw him pass the window with his torch, going to keep his appointment, laughing to himself in the fog. And I knew his laugh. I knew what that laugh meant, and I knew he had gone to bleed her till there was nothing left, and that she would pay, and pay, and pay, and he would never be done. I knew what he was, miss. I had always known. I was the only one who knew." She drew a breath. "So I followed him up the back stairs," she said, quiet, the way I knew how, and I heard them in the passage below, low voices and her saying, "I have no more," and him laughing, and I stood on the stairs in the dark with my hand on the wall, and I thought of Mam, and of the money he'd taken all his life and given back nothing, and of the shop that was never going to be, and I picked up the candlestick from the niche at the head of the stairs, where the Colonel keeps it for the blackouts. It was heavy, miss. It felt like it had been waiting there all my life for me to pick it up. Miss Marple spoke then, very gently. "You struck him, Rosie. He had her by the arm," said Rosie. "He had her by the arm, and he was shaking her, laughing, and she was begging, and I saw her face in the light of his torch, and it was the face of a woman who was done, miss, the way Mam was done, the way women are done by men like my brother who take and never give. And I thought, if she pays him, she'll pay him all her life. And I lifted the candlestick and I brought it down. She looked at her hands. He let her go, and he turned, and I saw his face. And then there was the sound, and he went down against the door. I heard his hand on the wood. I heard the scrape of it, and I thought, that door'll show a mark. Someone'll see. And I went down the stairs, and I wiped the door with my apron, and I set the candlestick back in its niche, and I dragged him to the foot of the stairs, and I laid him there, and I went up in the dark and took the letters and the paper from his room. I knew where he kept them, he'd told me. We were partners, miss. And I came down and out through the area and across the yard, and I was home and in my bed with my Sunday gloves on, in case there was blood on my hands, before the clock struck the half, and the fog covered me, and the fog covered everything. She lifted her head, and there were tears on her face, and she did not wipe them. "And then you came, miss," she said to Miss Marple, "asking about the polish, and about the door that had to be wiped twice, and I saw you look at the candlestick in its niche, and I knew I had been seen, in every particular, by an old lady with blue eyes who misses nothing, and I thought, she'll have me, and I was not sorry, miss. I was not sorry, and that is the truth." "The flowers," said Miss Marple quietly, "the chrysanthemum on my pillow, and the note, and the crushed flower at my door. I took them from her garden," said Rosie, "to frighten you off. I thought if you were afraid you'd stop. I thought an old lady would be frightened of a threat in the dark. I knew it was wrong, miss, and I did it anyway, because I was not done yet, and I thought I could be done quietly, and go away, and nobody the wiser." Her voice cracked. "But I was never going to be done, was I, miss? Because you were never going to stop." The wind moved in the passage, and the house was very quiet. "I did not mean her to hang," said Rosie at last, in a whisper. "I meant her to be looked at. I meant her to be looked at the way she looked at my mother, my brother, and everybody she used and dropped. I wanted her to know what it felt like to be seen for what she was. And I see now," she looked at Mrs. Frayne, where she stood holding the doorpost, still as a tree in frost. "I see now that she knows. She knew before I did what I meant to do. She saw it in my face the first night I came into this house, and she said nothing, and she has waited all this week for me to come to her, and I could not come, and you came instead." Mrs. Frayne spoke then, for the first time since the door had opened. Her voice was quiet and utterly tired. "She did not tell you to come," she said. "I sent her away, Miss Marple. On the Tuesday, when the papers were full of the doctor who was not a doctor, I sent her away. I gave her a sovereign and her cousin's address at Chullerton, and I told her to stay there till I came for her, because I knew what she was, and I knew what she had done, and I had it in my mind to bear it for her." She looked at Rosie, and her eyes were old. "I was going to tell the inspector myself this very night, and let them take me, and let the truth be what it was. And then you came through my garden gate, and I thought, let her tell it, and let the girl go free. She is young, she has a life, I have had mine." Chapter 18. The Lamp in the Lane. Inspector Quill took them both, in the end, Rosie Gribble, in the back of the police Wolseley, with her head high and her hands folded, and Mrs. Frayne in the seat beside the inspector, for she had asked, with her old, dry courtesy, whether she might ride in front, as she did not care to sit with the maid. It was past midnight when the car turned out of the lane, and the fog had thinned to a mist that lay on the fields like a seam of silver, and the village slept and knew nothing until morning. Miss Marple stood at her cottage window and watched the tail lamp dwindle between the hedges, and then she went to her kitchen and made herself a cup of tea, the way one does when the world has been out of joint and one has had a hand in putting it back, and the tea is the only ceremony that will answer. She did not feel triumphant. She had never felt triumphant over a confession. In all the years, she felt what she had always felt, which was the particular tiredness of having seen clearly into a sad human heart, and the particular gratitude that her own heart was small and her own sins modest, and that God had given her the temperament of a watcher rather than a doer. The story, when it came out, and it came out as these stories do, in the Mercury and at the Plough and on the church porch and over every tea table in Malpit Green, had about it a shape that satisfied the village and burdened it at once. The dead man, they learned, was not a doctor, but an orderly, a rogue, a blackmailer, who had come to the village to bleed a woman of his old acquaintance, and had been struck down, at the moment of his triumph, by the sister he had made his partner and betrayed. Rosie Gribble, the maid who had polished the same door twice, was taken to the assizes and tried for murder, and the jury, after a great deal of thought and a great deal of eloquence from her counsel on the subject of provocation and a lifetime of service, and a brother who was, by any measure, a monster, brought in a verdict of manslaughter. And the judge, who was old, and had seen the worst of human nature and the best of it, and had heard everything that could be said on both sides, sentenced her to 3 years, and recommended that she be considered for early release, and added, in a voice that was reported by the Cholaton Mercury and read aloud in the Plough, that the law has its course, and mercy has hers, and this court hopes they shall meet before the term is out. Mrs. Oriel Frayne was charged with no crime, for there was none she had committed that could be proved against her, and the village, having 62 years of her among them, and her husband's name, and her garden, and her silver cup, found it easier to believe that she had been a victim in that house on the night of the fog than that she had been anything else. And so it was. She remained at Honeysuckle Lodge, and she grew older, and her chrysanthemums, in the following autumn, took the cup again, and if she sometimes looked at a servant girl in the lane with a particular stillness, nobody thought anything of it, or said anything of it, or wished to. The village did not approve of Rosie Gribble, exactly, a maid who had killed a man, even such a man, and lied about it, and very nearly hanged an innocent woman by her lies, was not a figure the village could love, but it understood her, which is a different thing, and often a kinder one. The Plough, after a decent interval, allowed that the doctor fellow had it coming, and the girl was her brother's keeper, and there, but for the grace of God, go we all, which was the village form of absolution. Bert, the young man she had walked out with, waited faithfully through the trial, and went to see her at the prison on the first visiting day, and went again, and when she came out, at the end of 2 years and a half, he was at the station with a bunch of chrysanthemums, of all things, and she laughed and cried and took them, and they were married in the spring, in the church at Malpit Green, with the fog a world away and the sun on the graves. Miss Marple, who had given the bride a pair of silver sugar tongs and a jam pot of her own making, sat in her pew and watched Rosie Gribble, no, Rosie Clough now, walk down the aisle on Bert's arm, and thought about the odd ways of justice and the odder ways of mercy, and of how a girl who had once polished the same door twice to wipe away the mark of her own guilt had found, in the end, that there are some marks that no polishing will remove, and that the only remedy for those is time and work and the love of a plain young man and the quiet of an ordinary life. And that winter, walking home from the church through the early dark, with the lights of the village coming out one by one across the valley, she met Mrs. Frayne on the lane in her grey shawl with the fringe, and the two women stood a moment in the cold and looked at each other, and Mrs. Frayne said, "It is a strange thing, Miss Marple. I have spent 20 years being afraid of the past, and now the past is done, and there is nothing left to be afraid of. I had not expected, I had not expected to feel so light. I know, said Miss Marple gently. It is the same with the flowers, you know. A chrysanthemum carries its whole summer in its head, all the growing and the waiting, and then the frost comes, and the head is cut, and the plant stands light again, ready for next year. It is the way of things. We survive, Mrs. Frayne. That is the whole of the matter, in the end. We survive, and we go on planting. Mrs. Frayne looked at her for a long moment, and then she did a thing that surprised them both. She laughed. A small, dry, genuine laugh, the first of its kind in 20 years. You are a terrible woman, Miss Marple, she said. You see everything, and you forgive everything, and neither of those is quite respectable. They are both very tiring, said Miss Marple with perfect truth. Good night, my dear. Mind the frost on the lane. She went on down the hill to her cottage, and lit her lamp, and stood at her window, looking out at the lights of the village through the bare branches, and thought about the maid who had polished the same door twice, and the woman who had washed her shawl at midnight, and the man who had died of his own greed at the foot of a steep flight of stairs, in a house where a candlestick stood ready in a niche, as it always had and always would. And she thought that villages are very much like the sea, calm on the surface and full of moving things beneath, and that it is only the patient watcher on the shore who sees the patterns of the deep. She drew the curtain, and the lamp made a warm square of the window, and the fog came down again upon Marlpit Green, mild and white, erasing the world until morning. And behind the lit window, the old lady in the wool cardigan sat down in her chair, with her knitting in her lap, and was, as she had always been, as she would always be, exactly what she appeared to be. Only the chrysanthemums on the mantelpiece, one broken and one crushed, standing side by side in a jar of water, might have told a different story, if flowers could tell anything at all, which, as every gardener knows, they cannot and never do.